And welcome back to Learnanatomy. I know it's been a little bit of time since we've actually spoken and given you some new learning, but I'd like to thank Carol and her students in particular for asking us to produce a video explaining pain and how we understand pain, how pain travels within our body, how we make sense of pain, and more importantly, understand the anatomy of pain. So this video will focus on helping you better understand how we experience pain, how we interpret that pain, and the pathways that pain travel. So with me, I have a few prompts. I've got my head, and the key players or components that we really need to take into account are the brain, the spinal cord, and together, as you well know, those are called the central nerves. So we're thinking about areas within the brain that are going to be really important in terms of the journey of how the sensation of pain in a different part of the body travels up towards the brain, and the brain makes sense of that and then sends a corresponding message to either block the pain or to make us aware that we are experiencing different types of pain. So where does our journey start? Well, let's think about either through trauma, injury, or through massage, if you work in that field, how we could inflict pain. So let's assume that you have a nail that punctures the trunk or pierces the hand. What we have within our body, spread throughout our body, are pain cells. And these cells have got a specialist makeup and a specialist name. These are these cells that understand or experience the first cog of pain are called think of your nose, nociceptor cells. And there are two types. If you want to get more involved with them, the first type is called the alpha delta fibers. And what they have myelin or protective coating around the cells, so they're like specialist nerve cells. And they mainly help us interpret and deliver sharp pain. So when you're experiencing sharp pain, these alpha delta nociceptor cells pick up that. The other type is called the C fiber cells, and they help us to make sense of more burning pain. So pain that is not as sharp as the first one, but a pain that seems to be there for a long time that could be seen as or construed as burning pain. So the nociceptor cells are important in terms of the first part of the journey of pain. So they pick up pain and they relay that pain message towards the spinal cord. So in your anatomy classes, you may have looked at and considered the spinal cord. So here I have my friend who popped out of the book. If we look inside his brain, we understand that the brain continues throughout the body through the spinal cord. So what we have, the continuation of the brain on the posterior aspect of the vertebral bodies is the spinal cord that travels all the way down the vertebral column. So incoming nerves or sensory nerves, another word for that in medical talk is afferent, afferent nerves, bring the sensation of pain through the nociceptor cell. The nociceptor cell releases chemicals, neurotransmitters, and the neurotransmitter that it releases to indicate that there's a sensation of pain is something called substance P. Think of that P for pain. Now all incoming messages enter the spinal cord at the back end of the cord. And if we look at the anatomy of the spinal cord and we cut through it, a transverse cut, we will see that there's white matter on the outside of the spinal cord where the axons are, and then the grey matter is shaped in the shape of an H where the cell bodies are. But if we look at the brain, the grey matter's on the outside and the white matter appears to be inside the brain, so it swaps over in the brain. But the important thing is that within the spinal cord, the H-shaped grey matter is important in terms of where the incoming nerves go. So the nociceptors relay that pain message to the posterior or dorsal horn, the back end of that H shape. Over there we have what we call a second order neuron. And what it does, so let's assume that the pain was on the right hand side of the body. That incoming nerve will enter the right hand side of the posterior aspect of the H-shaped horn, or known as the dorsal horn. The second order neuron will then cross over, so it takes that pain message when substance P is released. A neurotransmitter then communicates with the second order nerve cell, which crosses over. So if the pain was over there, the second order crosses over, and then the signal travels up to the brain in what we call the ascending pathway. So it's like a lift. It enters a lift and it travels up towards the brain. The way in which it travels up towards the brain, the pathway it travels, is called the spinal thalamic tract. Think of the spine and a part of the brain, thalamus, which is the relay center of the brain. So all incoming messages that enter the brain pass through the relay center, the thalamic part of the brain. Okay? So now that pain pathway has crossed over the spinal cord, and what was experienced on the right hand side is now traveling up the left hand side. And it comes all the way up the spinal cord in a lift. Imagine this lift going up all the way up until it reaches the brain, and it reaches a critical component of the brain, the thalamic part, or the thalamus. Once it's there, the thalamus makes sense and then considers which part of the brain to send that message to. So if I can use another prompt here, this is our brain split in two, as you can see. When we get to the brain, we know that if you've studied your anatomy, you will understand that the outside of the brain is called the cortex. And what we would have is an area in the brain called the somatosensory cortex. In other words, the whole body is mapped out within the brain. And we would see that aspects of the body appear a lot larger, or certain parts of the body, like the face, the lips, the hands, genitals as well, will appear very large. And that mapping out on both the right and the left hand side is called the homunculus. It's that figure of that little man with big lips and big hands. The reason being why certain parts of the body are perceived or drawn as larger, because that's where we have a greater concentration of incoming or sensory nerves. What happens then if the pain was experienced in the trunk? That second order neuron within the thalamic part of the brain, the thalamus, synapses or does lunch and connects and joins with another neuron called the third order, and that third order will take it to the relevant part of the sensory cortex. So if it's the trunk, it will take it up to the trunk. Once that part of the brain has understood that there's pain in the trunk, that's the incoming message, it relays that information to the motor part of the brain, and a message is sent down the spinal cord this time. So instead of the lift coming up, we know whatever comes up has to eventually go down. That message then goes down the spinal cord to the corresponding part that experienced the pain. But what we also know is that at critical points within this journey, coming up and going down, we can block the signal of pain reaching the brain. And that is the theory called the pain gate theory. And that theory understands how the second order nerves can be blocked at critical points so that the signal of pain may not reach the higher order of the brain. Or when the corresponding message is sent down on the descending pathway, it can inhibit that message or that pain signal reaching a particular part of the body. But that we will discuss in another video early in 2018. What I really wanted to do today was summarize the incoming message of pain and give you a better understanding of how we interpret and make sense of pain. So to sum up in a few thoughts, what we've said or captured on this film are the following. Remember that we need a nerve cell to help us understand that we are experiencing pain. And those nerve cells that are specialist nerve cells are called nociceptor cells. There are two types. They are relatively small in size. The first type is the alpha delta cells, and they have myelin around them, and they help us experience sharp pain. The other type is the C fiber, which is smaller than the alpha delta, and they help us experience burning pain, but they don't have sufficient myelin. What happens then is that the nociceptor cell synapses with the second order nerve cell in the spinal cord, in the posterior or dorsal horn within the gray matter where the cell bodies are. So it crosses over, and the nociceptor cell releases a neurotransmitter called substance P. Once that substance P is released, that second order nerve cell, which crosses over, so if the sensation was on the right hand side, the nerve cell helps to bring the message in the spinal cord from the right hand side of the spinal cord to the left hand side of the spinal cord. And then that message travels up through the second order nerve cell through a tract on the side called the spinal thalamic tract. And that goes all the way up into the brain, into the thalamus of the brain. And the thalamus is an important relay center within the brain. What happens then is that that second order nerve cell synapses with the third order cell, which still stays on the left hand side if the sensation initially was experienced on the right side. Remember, it crosses over in the spinal cord and it travels up, and then that message will be relayed to the somatosensory part of the brain, where the homunculus is found, where the body is mapped out, and the corresponding region that was affected. So if it was the trunk, that would go to the trunk part. If it was the hand, it would go to the hand, the back, so forth and so on, within the somatosensory cortex. Once that message has been understood, there's a relay from the somatosensory cortex to the motor cortex, and then a signal is sent through the descending pathway back to that body part. And in the next video, we'll describe how that pain signal can be blocked in terms of the track down and up. So this video was really to introduce you and explain the key components of the pain pathway through the sensory afferent spinal thalamic tract from the spinal cord to the brain.